Sugi, welcome to Waterstones.
Thank you so much for having me.
And congratulations, I should say.
Thank you.
The trophy is there behind you,
There she
looking
is.
resplendent in front of your book. Sometimes I'll ask authors how they would feel about winning a prize, but I imagine you're mainly feeling quite tired because you've been on a whirlwind of interviews in the last 24 hours. But I mean, how does it feel to sort of have your name read out in front of all those amazing people last night?
That was wild. That was just wild. I saw a couple of years ago, Ruth Ozeki got up there and said, "This is absurd." And I thought, I've been watching, what is this party like? And then I was like, oh, there's the line.
Yeah.
So yeah, it feels extremely surreal to be in such company.
It was a fantastic evening with some very powerful speeches, actually, about the prize and about what it's about. And then I was really fascinated to hear you talking about your journey, I suppose, with this book, and that you started writing it in 2004, which of course is 20 years ago now. Can you tell me a little bit about the process of writing this book? Because it's clearly been a long road and it's required a lot of research and work. Tell me about maybe the beginning of the book and why it's taken this long for us to have it in our hands.
Sure. So I started working on this book inadvertently while I was researching my previous novel, and I stumbled upon a bit of research that really wouldn't fit in there and that I couldn't stop being interested in. So I was an MFA student at the time, and I wrote a story using that research for a class, and got a strong response to it and kept going. But it was the hunger. There's a hunger strike that appears in the book, so it was that hunger strike, and I wrote it backwards. And some of that is still in the novel. So that was kind of the beginning of it, and that hunger strike, I knew I couldn't write it from the point of view of the hunger striker. Who else would be there? Who would be watching? A young woman. She's a medical student. And then we were kind of off to the races. And she was a very bossy narrator.
Oh, that's interesting. So is it another one of these sort of instances where the character ends up helping to sort of drive the writing of the book?
Yes, I think so. It ended up being about her in a way that I hadn't entirely anticipated. And that the shape of that even kept changing. The book is now mostly set in Sri Lanka, but it used to have longer sections in New York. Some of those sections were awful, and that's why they're no longer in the book. But yeah, so, like many other writers, I sort of chucked hundreds of pages that were not working. But I think you have to write those pages, I guess, to get to the other ones.
Often I have discovered that some of my favourite books have always been much, much bigger books, and they have been whittled down to the thing that you actually read. And that's always a benefit to the book, I think. Sashi is a fantastic narrator, and we'll talk about her a little bit later, but there must have been, as I say, sort of huge amounts of research because of the real life events that you depict in the book. And you have a journalistic background, is that right? So I wondered whether that helped with the sort of research side of things, and then how you then turn that sort of factual information into something that you can make a fiction from.
Yeah, I think having a background as a journalist gave me a lot of comfort with interviewing, and I think I was taught by the people who trained me as a journalist that I should begin with the assumption that information is available, and I should just try to figure out how to get it, right? And so rather than assuming that someone won't talk to me, I'll ask. And if they say no, kind of that's the worst that can happen, really. So to try in that way, and to be a little less shy about being in conversation with other people. And then, if someone tells me the kind of story that seizes my imagination in some way, sometimes what I do is tell them a story back. You've just told me a story about this. Would this then be plausible, like a slightly transformed version, or maybe even like something that might occur in parallel? If this happens to my character, would that be plausible with what you just told me? And then, so some of those people actually ended up, I don't know if they themselves would put this word to it, but they were a little bit workshopping with me.
Okay.
Which was fun. Some of those people were great at plot. And would have really strong opinions about what was believable for characters and what wasn't, and what they wanted to happen, and how certain people had been, or what certain types of people had been like, what they read. There are books in the book that the characters read, and I had some feedback on what the characters were reading. And so those books were taken off the shelf and replaced
Okay.
at least once. And they're key to the plot also. So, so that was some of the sort of conversation that we were having. I think I was able to have a wide-ranging conversation and also to let it go in directions that I hadn't originally planned.
Yeah. I presume that kind of veracity would have been important to you as a writer anyway, but is there an element where when you're writing about a civil war that it feels very important to get that kind of, I suppose, that bearing of witness right, you know?
Well, I think there have been some really wonderful books set in Sri Lanka or about Sri Lanka that people contend with the facts in different ways, but a lot of the history is contested. If you go on Wikipedia, I remember, going on Wikipedia while I was writing this book and, article locked for conflict or for dispute resolution. Right. I think I had that phrase at some point memorized, and different iterations of that are people kind of arguing in the comments or like, here a source is needed. Right. So there are a lot of arguments about things that in other situations one might find basic or one might be like, why would this not already be established? So I was interested in surfacing narratives that had been in some way submerged or obscured, and that after sort of asking around and checking, that I had feelings about which version I thought I wanted to see on the page, and trying to put that version kind of back where people could see it. So that was part of what I was interested in, because so much of war is also about propaganda, and that was certainly true, right, in Sri Lanka. Everyone issuing propaganda and trying to tell their single stories, to borrow Adichie's phrase. And so, right, like the Tamil Tigers were, to talk about a single story, they claimed to be the sole representative of Tamil people. So they're like, oh, we're the only story.
Yeah.
So to write something that was a counter to that and was messier, which was truer to what I understood from people who I had spoken to.
Anybody who picks up the book in a bookshop, on that first page, it's a really bold first page. It's a really bold opening to the book where the word terrorist is there in the first sentence, and you sort of look at what that, I suppose, not what the word means, but what we might think of when we think of a terrorist. And you're very keen to point out that in this book, we'll be talking about real people who are as real as the non-terrorists, if you like, in the book. Tell me a little bit about, I suppose, confronting that head on, and I suppose the humanity that's contained within this book.
Thanks for that question. That's a really thoughtful reading of that page. That page was one of the first pages that I wrote, and I did start the book in 2004, so that wasn't, it was still sort of under the shadow of 9/11, and the war on terror, the rhetoric of the war on terror was moving into the mainstream. People were using the language of terrorism before that, but really all of a sudden, more and more people were using it. And I do come from a community where that language had been kind of launched against us for much longer than that. So I was sort of watching everyone else begin to adopt this language or to consider it. And I think I was so often confronted with it that I think on some level I was a bit like, well, if I've got to confront it all the time, you can too. So, it is quite intentionally, it's a bit argumentative and a bit provocative. It's a little bit of like an invitation, but maybe also kind of a dare to think in a more complex way about, if you call someone a terrorist, you're sort of saying you don't have to talk to them. So it can be a way of getting out of the conversation. And to encourage people to not do that. And to think about, right, if we have language for violence that is created and that comes from non-state actors, and that is, right, that's how we use the word terror, and how we use the word terrorism. Like, how do we think about state terror? And then if we don't have language for that, maybe we shouldn't be using any of that language at all. So in my nonfiction, I don't use the word terrorism really unless I'm addressing it critically in some way. I use militant or something else, so that I feel like I can have a conversation about it or really have a good think. And I feel like that language prevents the good think.
It's interesting what you were saying earlier about trying to find, I suppose, the facts on something like a Wikipedia page. It's so contested. And is there a place where perhaps fiction is the space in which you can really look at the complexities of a situation, and I suppose more like the humanity and the human stories of an event like a civil war.
I hope so. I think that you're more able to explore, right? The terrain of fiction is consciousness, and to think about how living in those circumstances would alter your consciousness, what it would feel like. I think that fiction is the best positioned to do that, at least with my particular toolbox. That was where I felt able to enter and to ask a lot of questions and not feel obliged necessarily to resolve them. To sort of put on the page a big mess and not to pretend that it had all been tied up neatly.
I suppose with fiction, we are used to the author putting, as you say, you can put a mess on the page, and the job is for the reader to complete that, isn't it? Is to take those words and then have their own thoughts about what it might mean and what it makes them feel.
I think that this book does have a particular relationship to audience that is part of that first page that you referenced, where there's direct address. The character Sashi continually addresses a you, and you have to think about, are you the you?
Yeah.
Is she talking to me? And and she has some frustration with her role as the explainer. Kind of how did she get here? Well, you're in a diaspora. It's fun. So, sometimes if you're the only Sri Lankan in the room, someone's going to assume that you have authority, and maybe you don't actually know everything. On the other hand, there might be conversations in which people won't believe you, right? So she is also sometimes telling stories, right? And she says, you have to understand this is really what happened. So she's interrogating her role as a narrator. People don't necessarily think of someone like her or someone like me as a narrator. And then she's also interrogating who that you is. Who do we assume gets an explanation? Who deserves an explanation? Who has to do that kind of labor? And I mean, as you say, the reader kind of completes the story. How has the work of a reader changed in the past? I don't know. When is the invention of the internet? Like 19...
I remember it, but I was...
but right, reading is, now I put all this food in the book, for example, and I don't really explain the food particularly. So either you've eaten it and or you are Googling, or you're going on.
Yeah.
But you have that tool. So the reader has a larger set of options to kind of fill in what things might mean to them. Yeah. Which makes it a really exciting time to write.
This book is covering conflict, and as I said earlier, sort of through the interviews that you've done, you are taking that sort of witness testimony and fictionalizing it and making sure that we can all read it. But there's a particular side to conflict which, through your narrator Sashi, you're able to cover, which is how women in particular are affected by conflict. And it felt very, again, powerful last night in a room full of women celebrating women writers, and men there to support that too, of course. But it feels as though that's particularly important in this book, the female perspective of conflict. Can you tell me a little bit about writing that? Because some of it's very difficult to read, and therefore I presume very difficult to write.
Are you thinking of any section in particular?
I think that if we're talking about how sexual violence is used to coerce the population, that feels to me to be a really potent subject to be writing about. And I think now, if you're looking at the news, almost at any time you can watch a conflict on the TV and you won't see that necessarily, but it's really important to write about it and think about it.
That's true. Yeah, I think the narrative of Tamil women in the Sri Lankan Civil War has largely been dominated by women who took up arms. And I think that those stories are really important, and I've been grateful to have access to them myself, to read them, to hear those perspectives. And also the women that I knew who were telling me their stories were civilians. And I think I've, over the years, developed a lot of very strong feelings about civilians in war, because there isn't, like in the US, there's Veterans Day, but there's no Civilians Day. The way that the civilian is supposed to be the fabric of civil society, and yet they're constantly erased. And the civilians whose labor is most erased tend to be women, who are in conflict, taking, in many ways, the brunt of the violence, who are, keeping their families together, packing them up when they're displaced and moving them to different homes, protecting their children, feeding their children. In kind of policy, there's a phrase, women-headed households, right? And in Sri Lanka, there are so many of them because of the circumstances of the war. Women-headed households below the poverty line, for example. Who are the people who are dealing with the aftermath? And not just the aftermath, but all of that. That is also, it's a front of some kind. And in the book, for example, there's the mother's front, and the women who tried to help their children to have lives that were not shaped by militarized violence, whether that was the state assuming a certain thing and detaining someone of a certain profile, or someone joining a movement, and those mothers wanted their kids to go to school. And sexual violence is certainly, right, we see this all the time now, and or I guess you don't necessarily always see it, but I think more and more people are coming to understand that women are vulnerable, particularly vulnerable to sexual violence. Of course, it also happens. It happens to people of all genders, but historically, it has been women, and the stigma around that, the ways that people are discouraged from talking about it. I found this to be really powerfully countered by one of the people who was an inspiration for a character, Dr. Rajani Thiranagama, who in a nonfiction book called The Broken Palmyra wrote a section called No More Tears, Sister, that is partly about sexual violence. And that's also the title of a CBC film connected to her life, for which Michael Ondaatje did the voiceover. And so, her life and example, and sort of the power of her writing about that, and other women also in conversation with her and making their own space in civil society to talk about that and the impact of that. It is hard to write about. When I was in college, I was sometimes covering sexual assault as a campus reporter, which was a really long time ago. And I frankly am not sure that I did a very good job of that. But I think that some of what I had learned under those circumstances went into this, some of the lessons that I learned doing that. And over the years, many of those scenes were revised as I learned more and more about the language that one might use to talk about that. So, that is some of the challenging material in the book.
Thank you for such a thoughtful answer to that question, which was slightly garbled. Again, last night, one of the things that I really enjoyed when you were accepting the award was you made a reference to your own brother and the endless jokes he keeps making about the title of your book. But I wondered whether, with all of the sort of factual research you were doing for this book, whether when it comes to sitting down to write about a sister and her brothers, whether there is some of your own familial relationships sort of in there in order to make those kind of things work, or whether you've kept him well away from the book itself.
I think his sense of humor is not necessarily completely, it's not really represented in that book. But maybe there's, no, it really, it isn't. He deserves some creative rendering of his own, and it's not this. He has been a wonderful cheerleader for the book, and also because of his very distinctive sense of humor. It's when you are dealing with such serious material, it's great to have friends and family around you who are sort of like, would you like to come and watch 30 Rock with us? It's good to have that moment. So I'm grateful to have had people who said, go and do the hard thing and then come and play Scrabble. And he, I think I also just I have scads and scads of cousins. And in Tamil families, that kinship structure will treat a cousin almost more like a sibling. I was very happy to have one of my cousins at the prize ceremony. My cousins have all around the world have helped me and cheered for me and asked me questions and fed me and housed me, and so that I think was actually a relationship that I was often drawing on. I only have one brother, and Sashi has four. Which maybe is just a testament to how much I actually like my family. That I was like, let's multiply you.
Fantastic. Well, listen, Sugi, it's so good to speak to you about this book, especially given the time that you have given to it and to those people's stories. I hope it won't be so long to wait for your next book.
Me too.
Are you working on something completely different?
I'm working on a few different things, and none of them have quite stuck yet. And
Okay.
at least one of them is actually just a project that is amusing and funny and light. And while I worked on this book, I taught a humor class, and that was, that got me interested in things that are very different than this.
Okay, maybe this will be the novel that will contain your actual brother and his unique sense of humour. Anyway, Sugi, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, especially after the celebrations last night, and congratulations once again.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be here.